Hello everyone, welcome back to CCC's Curious Kitchen. I'm Claire and today we are finishing up our pumpkin spice custard buns. We'll be making the dough, wrapping the filling in it, and steaming the buns. Alright, let's go over our ingredients. So here I have a lot of pumpkin puree. For this recipe, I wanted to pack in as much pumpkin as I could for a brighter color. So because pumpkin puree contains a lot of water, it's basically replacing the liquid in our recipe. For my dry ingredients, I'm using instant yeast in this recipe. So because we don't have like water or milk or a liquid to dissolve yeast into, I'm using instant yeast. So compared to active dry yeast, instant yeast are in smaller grains, so it's much easier for them to absorb water and hydrate, so we don't need to dissolve them into another liquid first. Now I have both flour and cornstarch in this dough. So I first tried this dough with all flour, no cornstarch, and the result was a pretty good bun, but it was a little tougher than I wanted. And so this toughness comes from gluten. So gluten is a protein just like the egg proteins we talked about last week. And when they get, really close together and develop a really strong network, the result is a tough texture. So there are, several ways we can reduce the toughness of gluten and add tenderness. And the way I decided to go for this recipe was by adding cornstarch. So cornstarch, first of all, we're just using less flour and replacing it with cornstarch, so there's less gluten in the bowl to begin with. And just as we talked about last week, the starch can act as a physical barrier between the gluten proteins and prevent them from tightening and toughening too much. In here I also have some brown sugar, so that's going to contribute to flavor, but sugar also contributes to tenderness. Like we talked about last week, sugar really likes water, so one of the things it does is keep it away from gluten, just as it keeps it away from the egg proteins. And sugar also actually binds to the proteins that make up gluten and prevents them from binding to each other. Lastly, I just have a little bit of cinnamon in here. In bread doughs, typically, you don't want to go too heavy on the spices because they can influence yeast activity. So I just have a little in here, and we're gonna let the filling do the rest of that work. All right, so I'm gonna get started by just whisking all my dry ingredients together to make sure they're evenly combined before I add the pumpkin. And then I'm going to add my pumpkin. So depending on how you cooked your pumpkin and the type of squash you're using, the water content is going to vary. So you might need to adjust every time. So you can either add all of the pumpkin into the dough, knead it together, and then add more flour or water as needed. But since I do like to pack pumpkin into here, what I like to do is add most of my pumpkin and then start kneading the dough, and then add, little bits and little bits until I've reached the right consistency. Okay, so my dough has come together. I did end up using exactly 240 grams, and you'll see when I'm kneading, but this is a fairly stiff dough. And you can also see right now that it's not smooth, so we are going to knead this until it is smooth. Now the goal of kneading is to align the gluten, and the, most common way of kneading, right, is to push away from you and then bring the dough back, rotate 90 degrees, push away and bring it back, rotate. And that can work for this. I also just wanted to share another kneading technique that I really like for stiff doughs. I saw this on Joy Huang's Instagram. But essentially you push away and bring it back, and then use your other hand to push away and bring it back. And you'll notice that this is a 90-degree angle. I personally just feel like it goes faster because I can kind of alternate hands like this, but whatever you're comfortable with. So I'm just gonna knead this until it comes together into a smooth dough. I've been kneading for about 10 minutes and the dough is now nice and smooth. So I'm gonna pop it back into the bowl, cover it, and let it rest for 15-20 minutes. And so the goal of this is not to let the dough rise, it's to let the gluten relax. So gluten is elastic, so when we're kneading, we keep on pulling it into new shapes, and all it really wants to do is just go back to its original shape. So that's why, like, the more you work with dough, the tighter it gets, because you're like stretching the gluten into new orientations, and it just wants to snap back to where it came from. So when we let the dough relax, we let the gluten kind of get used to their new orientation. So when we pull it back out, that's its kind of home base, and it's going to be much easier to work with. So I'm just going to let this sit, and we'll come back in 15-ish minutes. All right, so our dough is rested. It's much easier to work with now, which is helpful because we're going to divide it into separate pieces and then make them nice and round again. And just make sure everything's covered when you're not working with it so it doesn't dry out. So I'm going to move through the rest of these, let them rest, and we'll come back and start to shape the buns. So these cuties have been resting for about 10-15 minutes. So we're going to get started with the shaping. I have the nice rounded surface, and I'm going to put that face down. And flour the top a little bit. And we're just going to start rolling. And actually, traditionally, you would use a much smaller, thinner rolling pin, but I don't have one. So this is what we're using for now. And the goal is essentially to roll this out into a disc, maybe like 5 inches across, but you want the edges to be thinner than the center, so when we fold it all up, we won't get a big hunk of dough. So traditionally, you kind of roll into the center and out, rotate a tiny bit into the center and out, and kind of move around in a circle this way. All right. That looks good. And now we're gonna wrap these. So I'm gonna add a couple tablespoons of our filling. One of the nice things about these buns, I guess, is that we steam them face down, so it doesn't really matter what this side looks like. But what I like to do, and this is actually a good chance to practice your pleating skills too if you wanted to, is I'm right-handed, so I hold most of it in my left hand. And then I use my left finger here to feed a little fold into the dough, and I pinch it with my right finger. So left hand right here feeds a little dough in, and I pinch it together. And my thumb is gonna stay here the whole way around. And really, no matter how you do this, the most important part is you want to seal it so the custard doesn't leak out. So we're just gonna pinch it together, and we have a bun. And we're gonna steam these this way. Okay, so we have all 12 of our buns filled and almost ready to go. The last step is just let them rise. We want them to be poofier. They're not gonna reach double in size, but they're gonna be like a little bigger. Depending on the conditions of your kitchen, that may take 20-30 minutes. It could take an hour. To make it go faster, make sure you keep them in a warm place. Since it's winter here, I'm probably gonna set these on the radiator. So I'll see you back in half an hour or so. Okay, so our buns are nice and proofed. If you want to learn a little more about what the yeast are doing at this point, feel free to go back to our challah video from a few weeks ago. So they're ready to steam. But first I want to show you my steaming setup. I don't have a steamer per se, but all you need is some sort of pot. So this one is big enough to fit my plate. And then a pot with a lid, a tight fitting lid, so like this one. And then in here I've just set like a metal thing that will raise the plate kind of above the water a little bit. You can use like an upside down small dish or something, as long as it's heat safe. So I'm gonna set that in there. I have cold water in here. And then you want enough that it's not gonna boil dry, but you don't want the things you're steaming to get wet. So I'm just gonna put my plate of proofed buns into here with the cold water, and then I'm going to put the lid on. Now, because this lid is domed, any water that kind of collects on it kind of drips down the sides and it won't drip onto the buns. But if you're worried, if your lid is a little flatter and it doesn't do that, you can wrap it in a towel to absorb that condensation. All right, so I have my heat on high here. I'm just gonna wait until the water inside comes to a rolling boil, and then I'm gonna start timing 15 minutes. When it starts to boil, you can turn the heat down if you want. Just make sure that the intensity of the boil doesn't decrease. So let's talk a little bit about steaming and how it's different from baking. So the two biggest differences when we're steaming is one, the temperature, and two, the humidity of the environment. So because we have all this water underneath the buns, the temperature of the entire pot isn't going to go above the boiling point of water. So any heat that we add all goes into the water and turning it into steam. So because the temperature doesn't really go beyond, 212 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, the surface of the buns aren't going to brown. It's not going to get hot enough for that to happen. The second thing is that in a steamer, there's a lot more water vapor around than in the oven. So we can call a steamer a wet, humid environment, whereas an oven is a dry one. So what this means is that in our buns, the water isn't going to evaporate out of the buns. And that's actually one of the reasons our dough is so stiff, is because steamed buns don't need as much water in them because they're gonna keep them all while they cook. And so one of the interesting things that happens in this wet environment is that the buns form this like shiny skin on the outside. And that comes down to what's called starch gelatinization. And we see the same thing on the outside of bagels and pretzels. Those are boiled in water briefly before they're baked. But essentially, because there's so much moisture around them, the starch in the buns can absorb some of that moisture and thicken and gelatinize the same way they did with our custard earlier, actually. And that forms a thin film on the outside of the buns that reflects light. You might have seen this film like on the edges of a rice pot or a pasta pot after you pour the water out. This is the same thing. All right, so our buns are done. They look so round and so fluffy. These are best served warm. So if you need to, I just like to microwave them for a few seconds until they're soft and fluffy again. Make sure to cover them in the microwave though, or else they get like weird and hard and crunchy sometimes. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you give these a try. You can find the full recipe with all of the sciencey notes up on my website. Link will be down below. And that's it for now. I'll see you next time.